Xal'atath is now Azeroth's greatest threat, and what a journey for someone who started as a spooky voice in a little dagger. But that is her story, starting at the bottom, a literal slave to the Void, but now, in the most recent patch, she has ended Dimensius. But here's the thing, she is not some sort of master tactician, written to have a complex plan spanning thousands of years. She's smart, but she's not that type of character. She is a survivor, a deal maker, someone ready to bargain and cheat her way to victory. And now, there's only one move left to make, to consume Azeroth. Now though, we finally know Xal'atath's full story. So today, we've brought it all together, from her origin in the Void right through to her invasion of Silvermoon. So if you want to know what's going on with this character in the upcoming Midnight expansion, good news, this video has exactly been made for you. Our story begins in the Void. This is a time before Titan pantheons, before old gods, and it occurs on a planet simply known to us as Voidstorm. It has one rule, and that rule is survival of the fittest, and the greatest of these survivors are called the Dominar. This group sit at the top of the planet's brutal hierarchy, and Xal'atath was once one of these Dominar. That is her origin, a being of the Void who started at the bottom, then slowly consumed and dominated her way to the top. And this was a different era. It was an era of war with the Naaru. Xal'atath called it the Eternal Conflict. According to her, infinite armies clashed on endless battlefields. Meanwhile, and at a different level of scale, the gods of the Void were at war with themselves. Bargoth, Artosian, and Dimensius fought for dominance, until Dimensius consumed the others and reigned supreme. And that is when everything changed for Xal'atath. Because once he consumed his rivals, Dimensius looked outside of the Void. He wanted to consume reality. So he chose a personal herald, a harbinger, someone to travel the cosmos, find planets, and create a beachhead from which he could manifest. For this role, he chose Xal'atath, and for now, she was a slave to Dimensius. Yet, survival of the fittest demanded that one day she would be free. Xal'atath traveled the universe until she found her keys to freedom, and she found them on the planet called Koresh. She whispered to the planet's high priest Sal'hadar. He was the first of them to fall. She would then go on to corrupt the Nakoan Koreshi, who would wait millennia for her return. And all of this was in service to Dimensius. But when she was on that planet, Xal'atath discovered something. The Reshi Ribbons. Ancient Koreshi artifacts that somehow connected to the energy of the planet itself. They were so powerful that in them, Xal'atath saw her keys to freedom. So she began to work with the best and the brightest of Koresh to prepare for the coming of Dimensius. And what we're going to see is classic Xal'atath. It's her playing both sides. So she finds these Koreshi. They form up, they call themselves the Revel, and on the night the Void Lord manifested in the sky, Locust Walker joined the Revel. And here's where the story diverges. Locust Walker tells us he built immense arcane shields around Koresh's cities to hold off the Void. He says those shields eventually destroyed the corporeal form of the Koreshi, turning them into the Ethereals. But Xal'atath tells us something a little different. She says it was her power, along with the Reshi ribbons, that created the Ethereals. Perhaps it was her spells and the ribbons that empowered the shields, but either way, this was only the beginning of her plan. Next, she convinced Locust Walker and other members of the Revel to blow the Reshi ribbons up in Dimensius' face. But the ritual went wrong. The Revel fired too early, and instead of killing Dimensius, they shattered his essence. And their spell destroyed Koresh. It was a disaster for the Koreshi, but for Xal'atath, while not a complete victory, it was freedom. Her plan worked. At least for now, Dimensius was gone. So, she then traveled to another planet, one deeply infected by the old gods, one where she could hide out and plan her next move. By now, the Void had long had its claws in Azeroth, but not in the form of a Void Lord, rather the form of the old gods. They are being spat out into reality by the Void Lords as another tactic to consume reality. They had created a black empire for themselves, one that spanned the surface of the whole planet. But Xal'atath didn't arrive under the guise of a free woman. She arrived as harbinger of Dimensius. She convinced the old gods that she was still a herald for their boss. She witnessed their civil wars, and she in fact tells us of one such war in this piece from Legion.
I don't believe these lands have seen such carnage since the battle for Catan. Such a long time ago. It was here, in ages past, that the god of the deep lost a great battle to the god of seven heads. But as was so often the case, even defeat ultimately worked in N'Zoth's favor.
While adventuring with her in Legion, we receive many similar whispers describing her time, but there are things we didn't know. She had received the staff Void Song, which is claimed to have came from Dimensius himself. But, as we know, Dimensius was shattered. It could have been her flexing authority. But here's the real story. When she arrived, something had actually went wrong. The old gods had went off mission. They had Azeroth in the grasp of their hand, or rather their tentacles, but they hadn't finished the job of consuming her, of turning her to the void. And there's a good reason for that. Their empire stretched across the planet. Their tendrils sank deep beneath the earth. But Azeroth was not passive. Her own energy flooded out and changed the old gods. Just as we'd later come to learn, she was able to change other beings on the planet. And in the case of the old gods, to us, it appears she gave them a degree of free will. And with free will, they began to have desires. Desires that did not involve the planet ending, their empire ending, and them just being a tool to get a job done for Dimensius. They decided they wanted to be the Lords of Azeroth. But, you see, Xal'atath was still relatively weak at this time. A master manipulator, yes, but she couldn't face the old gods head-on. So what she did is devise an eternity-spanning plan for their downfall. While there, Xal'atath discovered something that N'Zoth was building below Ny'alotha, and whatever she found made her launch an invasion against the Old Gods. Her Void Revenants clashed against the faceless hordes of the Old Gods, but in a rare showing of unity, the usually fractured Old Gods came together. They captured and bound Xal'atath. Chained in fire, she was told she would watch Azeroth grow untold power without her, and that the planet's power would never be hers. In response, she accursed them of being mere pestilence masquerading as lords, literally a disease that's got a bit too uppity. But this wasn't just a taunt. This was not the end of Xal'atath's game. It was, in fact, just the beginning, and she had an eternity to play. But still, at the time, the Old Gods were in control, and they bound her to a blade of the Black Empire, a simple dagger, one that would be used to serve their will. Xal'atath lost, and she would go on to be their slave, or so they thought, because Xal'atath is a survivor. So she whispered in a voice only N'Zoth could hear. She asked him to consider how great he would be if only the other Old Gods did not stand in his path. She could make that a reality. All he needed to do was reach out and agree to her offer. One day, we know N'Zoth will agree to that offer. But for now, Xal'atath was bound to the blade, once again made a slave of a higher being. Xal'atath became a sacrificial dagger for the Empire. She cut open chests and ripped out hearts. But then it all ended. The Titans came and they destroyed the Black Empire. They imprisoned the Old Gods, and Xal'atath slipped into the shadows. Thousands of years later, trolls would be the ascendant race on Azeroth. They were set to become dominant. All they needed was a push. So Xal'atath worked her way into the hands of a witch doctor named Xando. Her whispers drove him to start a void-worshipping cult. She led the cult into the jungles to find a perfect sphere of black stone that drank in light. Xando pierced the stone with Xal'atath. He didn't realize that deep below, a horror of the Black Empire slept. and that this ritual summoned a Cathraxi general who took up Xal'atath. And together they called the sleeping legions of the Black Empire Akir from the deep burrows of the earth, and they brought war to Kalimdor. But the trolls, by then, forged the Empire of Zul and destroyed the Akir. They drove them to the four corners of the planet. This was then another loss for Xal'atath. But if we look deeper, we see she was already setting up future agents. A tribe of trolls known as the Drakari chased the Akir north. They forced them to burrow deep beneath what would one day be called Northrend. Those Akir slowly forgot the old god's ways, and they forged the empire of Azul Nerub. They would call themselves Nerubians, and sometime later, a group of those Nerubians left Northrend. They left Azul Nerub, and they set up the kingdom of Azj-Kahet, a kingdom that one day will fit perfectly into Xal'atath's plan. But before any of that, the surface of Azeroth was about to change forever. Even within their titanic prisons, the old god's influence spread. 5 dragon aspects had been empowered some time ago by the Titan's keepers in Azeroth, and one of these, Neltharion, delved into the deep places of the world. The deeper he went, the closer to N'Zoth he was, and N'Zoth's corruption sank into his mind. And in his growing madness, Neltharion created a rather famous object in the Warcraft canon called the Dragon Soul. It could contain the power of the other 4 dragon aspects, and with it, he could control them. But such a device can't come out of nowhere. It would need to be developed, and in doing that, Neltharion made a prototype of the Dragon Soul that we now call the Darkheart. He locked it in his private laboratories where it was forgotten by history. Neltharion would go on to become Deathwing during the War of the Ancients. That's when the Burning Legion was invading. The aspects went to war with each other, and then the world cracked. Most of Kalimdor collapsed into the ocean, and Ashara, the architect of this downfall, sank beneath the waves along with her highborn servants. Then, on the brink of death, as she was about to suffocate, she was offered a deal from N'Zoth. Serve him or die. So she accepted this deal and was transformed into the first Naga. And it was in the kingdom of these Naga that Xal'atath was next found. Ashara kept her for thousands of years, but eventually the Blade of the Black Empire made it back to land. The dwarven clans of Khaz were engulfed in brutal civil war. The Bronzebeards and Wildhammers versus the Dark Iron. Queen Modgud of the Dark Iron was approached by a nameless dwarf. He handed her a dagger and then disappeared from Shadowforge City, not to be seen again. Modgud, being a capable sorceress, felt the power of this dagger. Then she heard Xal'atath's whispers. Xal'atath offered her power. Modgud, of course, accepted, and together they summoned an army of golems and marched on the Wildhammer capital of Grim Batol. Modgud's golem army, along with void magic, pushed the Wildhammer clan back, and just as the golems cracked the city's gates, Modgud cast a curse designed by Xal'atath, one that flooded into Grim Batol and down through its deepest reaches. At first, it had no effect, and for Modgud, that was worrying, because the Wildhammers suddenly were able to rally. They turned the battle, and soon they were destroying Modgud's army. Eventually, they even surrounded her. Right when she needed Xal'atath most, Modgud was abandoned and cut down. But that's not all that happened. Screams were heard erupting from Grim Batol. The curse had finally taken effect. Dwarves were being transformed into cursed void creatures known as Scaradin. Hundreds of years later, Xal'atath would use that exact same curse to infect the Earthen Awakening machines on Khaz Algar. But for now, this was a successful experiment that furthered her goals. Her goals, though, were ambitious, and events were about to accelerate quickly. Far away, on the planet of Draenor, a group of orcs known as the Pale had been rejected by society. Why? Well, they had glimpsed into the Void. The Void whispered that they had a glorious legacy ahead, and that they would bring the Hour of Twilight. But unfortunately for them, Orc society had something quite different in mind. because that is when the Old Horde launched its invasion of Azeroth. Cho'Gall was sent to dominate or destroy the Pale Orcs, but instead, something different happened. He found them bowing to him, worshipping him. The Void told them that Cho'Gall was in fact their destiny, and so together they formed the Twilight's Hammer clan, and they invaded Azeroth along with the Horde. Many years later, a human priest known as Natalie Celine read about the rituals of these Pale Orcs. She learned that they used an ancient Void dagger. She swore to find and destroy this artifact. She found it, but she didn't destroy it. Like most, she became another unwitting pawn in the Void's game. You see, by now, Natalie Celine had become convinced that balance between light and shadow was in fact key. Unfortunately, the dagger became impatient with her and had her assassinated. But still, Xal'atath gained greatly from this, because Celine's teachings went on to found the Cult of Forgotten Shadows. That is the cult that opened the way for a shadow priest that one day would wield Xal'atath. From the beginning of World of Warcraft's story through to her introduction in Legion, Xal'atath worked from the shadows. Cho'Gall had reformed the Twilight clan into the Twilight cult. Xal'atath, of course, was involved. She was their dagger. And what many didn't know is how deep this cult's reach extended. You see, Archbishop Benedictus of Stormwind, otherwise, was known as the Twilight Father. He was powerful, deeply corrupt, but he refused to use Xal'atath. He knew the price of failure, and at the same time, across the world, a shadowy figure appeared to the fresh champions of Azeroth. This figure, thought to be Xal'atath, worked with the Twilights in Blackfathom Deeps. She created powerful void-touched weapons and armor. Next, she was found in the Altaric Mountains. She stood beside a light crystal, just like the one that we recently found in Hallowfell. This shadowy figure was again spotted in the Emerald Dream and watched us as we killed Cthulhu. All the while, we did her bidding in return for morsels of power. What she was doing was forging her relationship with us by, of course, fulfilling our needs to do more damage. And she promised that one day she would need our help with something big. What followed was Deathwing attempting the Hour of Twilight. Deathwing was, of course, working for N'Zoth, the same old god that Xal'atath had struck a bargain with. Of course, Deathwing failed, and it was a loss for the old gods. Of course, for Xal'atath, it was something different. It was an opportunity. By now, Benedictus was dead. A new figurehead, Twilight Deacon Farthing, was now in control of the cult. And unlike Benedictus, he foolishly chose to wield Xal'atath. Of course, he didn't realize that he was just a delivery service, but not one she would pounce upon immediately. But for that plan to start, the Legion would have to invade, and invade they did. In response to this, the priests of Azeroth created the Conclave, a group to represent all priests on Azeroth. It included shadow priests, and into this mix steps the player character. Moira Thessarian told us that Farthing was resurrecting something from the Black Empire. So we traveled to Tyr's tomb, and we found him with Xal'atath, moments from completing the ritual. But just as Farthing needed Xal'atath most, she moved on. She chose a new champion, us. At long last, we've reached the bit of the story where the player character meets Xal'atath and knows, in some way, what she is. But make no mistake, she was playing us, and to get a feeling for that, just consider this. From leading the Twilights to the perfect location, to making sure the Cult of Forgotten Shadows had a representative in the Conclave, it all came together. Xal'atath was in our hands, and we would become a leader of the Conclave. Xal'atath was right where she needed to be. Throughout Legion, Xal'atath helped us fight. She genuinely helped, because the Legion's victory would be her defeat. But the big development happened on the Legion's homeworld of Argus. Argus is where another pivotal character enters our story. And that is, of course, Alleria Windrunner. She had just spent 1,000 years fighting demons. She had become infected with the void. She was beginning to embrace it, and Locust Walker, that guy from earlier, the start of this video on the story in Koresh, he had appeared and was training her to grow in power and to grow in her ability to control and wield the void. All this culminated in Alleria consuming the essence of the fallen Naru Lura. Xal'atath watched on from within the dagger. She whispered, saying that the caterpillar had now become the butterfly, that Alleria was all but the voids now. From that moment, Alleria Windrunner became central to Xal'atath's plan, a plan that will culminate in midnight. And from that moment, Xal'atath would stalk Alleria's every move. While there's no doubt Legion's ending was a massive coup for Xal'atath, she did seemingly have to sacrifice her power to consume the corruption within the Sword of Sargeras. But soon, as the battle for Azeroth raged to life, she appeared in our lives again. As it turns out, a Tortolan collector had found her, and sure, she may no longer have had all the power we imbued her with during Legion, but she was still there, she was in the dagger, she was smart, she was able to whisper. This Tortolan then sold her back to us, and she immediately told us we had a great destiny ahead. But first, she needed to do something. She needed to get a body. Here then is the story of that body. In Quel'Thalas, a blood elf named Inannis had fallen to the void. It told her she would one day be important. She then starts a coven known as the Deep Watchers. They were given visions of a void stone in Drustvar. They went and they found that stone. But as they were about to perform their ritual, we arrived with Xal'atath in hand. Inannis suddenly realized why she was important. She was to be the vessel for Xal'atath, and that is when Xal'atath jumped from the blade into Inannis. Xal'atath was finally free, but it was not the last of the business she had to conduct. By this time, all but one of the old gods had been defeated, and that straggler, a survivor in his own way, was N'Zoth, the very old god who had a deal with Xal'atath. He was on the verge of manifesting the Black Empire across Azeroth, but he needed a champion. He foresaw major threats to his plan, so he needed this champion to do his dirty work. And that is where Xal'atath steps in. She, in her new body, brings us to the Crucible of Storms and delivers us to N'Zoth as his champion. Of course, for the average Warcraft player, this was a little bit of a bizarre move. It was very much us being played with. But it isn't just that. This moment would be the final time we would see Xal'atath for quite a few years indeed. With Xal'atath's end of the bargain paid, she was free from N'Zoth. She disappeared to find her own destiny. But rest assured, she was spending that time putting the final stage of her eternity-spanning plan into motion. As for the blade Xal'atath was once in, canonically, the Horde character gave it to Sylvanas. Then, through some back-channel diplomacy, she worked out a deal with Ashara. Nathanos then brought the empty blade to Ashara. You see, even without Xal'atath, that dagger was special. It was able to contain powerful beings. Ashara planned to kill N'Zoth with it, and in return, she would wreck the Alliance's fleet. And this is what brought us all to Nazjatar. Within Ashara's Eternal Palace, all these deals would finally come to a head. You see, N'Zoth knew that Ashara wanted to kill him. N'Zoth also knew the Horde wanted to wreck the Alliance fleet, so what he did was he gave the dagger to the Horde, so the Horde could give the dagger to Ashara. This would then allow Ashara to carry out her plan and kill N'Zoth. In return, Ashara would wreck the Alliance fleet. In their ideal world, the Horde would have a great victory, and Ashara would finally be free of her captor. But of course, we were effectively N'Zoth's champion, and we defeated Ashara right before she was able to kill N'Zoth. But not before, well, she did free him. Because to kill him, she would have to free him. We came in just at the right time. So, as the raid ended, N'Zoth broke free. He pulled Azshara, who still had the Black Blade on her person, through a void portal. We would next see Azshara during our assault on Ny'alotha, in our attempt to finally kill N'Zoth. We would free her, and in return, she would give us the dagger. This dagger would then be used by Rathian to crack the carapace of N'Zoth, ultimately allowing us to proceed through and kill the old god. Or so we think. The blade, rather suspiciously, hasn't been seen since. But hey, if speculation holds up, maybe it now contains N'Zoth instead of Xal'atath. But back to the main character of this story, because with all this done, it's finally time for Xal'atath to throw down. For us, the following years would be spent in the Shadowlands, followed by a period of peace. For Xal'atath, well, she was now free. No Dimensius, no N'Zoth, no Azshara, at least for now. And that meant it was finally time to devour Azeroth. First, she needed an ancient and powerful artifact. This artifact is the Darkheart. And that is where another character, a new character, comes in. He is called Iridikron. It's said that 20,000 years before the present day, during the Scaleborn War, Iridikron made terrible bargains to keep that war going. For all we know, those bargains may have been brokered by Xal'atath. But what we do know is that when he returned, he crashed through the Dragon Isles straight to Neltharion's personal laboratory. Within, he found the prototype Dragon Soul, which we now call the Darkheart. He would later give it to Xal'atath and promise to return once the Harbinger, her, had used it to tear Azeroth from the Titan's grasp. But that's not all he did. Just before he handed over the Darkheart, he consumed the essence of Galakrond, a deeply ancient threat, one suspiciously connected to the Void. And as we will go on to see, that essence was just the start of Xal'atath's plan. But that wasn't her biggest challenge. We were. So Xal'atath laid a trap, one designed specifically for us. You see, across the ocean, a nation of Earthen had broken free from their Titan programming. Xal'atath traveled to Khaz Algar. She began whispering into the ears of the weakest mortals she could find. She leaned on the arrogance of High Speaker Eric, and in twisting his mind, she was able to seed the Scaradin curse, the one from Grim Batol, into the Earthen's awakening machine. But that isn't all she did. She went to the lowest depths and found Azj-Kahet. There, she leaned on Queen Ansorek's insecurities, making Xal'atath effectively the shadow ruler of a Nerubian kingdom. Later, the Arathi would come. She leaned on their fear and isolation to create the Order of Night, roadblocks that we would one day fight. But for us to fight them, we would need a reason to go there. And that is where we enter the story again. Back home, Drendon rejoined the Kirin Tor. This was a little odd. He was an archmage long thought to be dead or perhaps missing, but he was a member of Dalaran's Council of Six. Of course, this was not the real Drendon. It was Xal'atath in disguise. For her, everything was falling into place, but to commence her plan, she needed the guest of honor. Suddenly, Xal'atath became very loud. Across Azeroth, her minions struck. The Kirin Tor sent its resident Void Hunter, Alleria, to investigate this fresh Void incursion. She discovered that a mysterious Harbinger was behind it all. Strangely, she found Shadowguard Ethereals attempting to break into Ulduar. They seemed like they were working for this Harbinger. Alleria's hunt continued and finally landed on Telogris Rift. That's where her Void Elves are based and where her mentor Locust Walker was presently holding off an invasion from the Void. A voice would taunt Alleria upon her arrival. It told her she would lose control one day, and that when she did, she would become powerful beyond anything in the Void. Then, an apparition appeared, an apparition of Turalyon, her husband. This almost broke Alleria's resolve. In the very last second, Locust Walker's voice boomed, and it called for Xal'atath to be gone. And with this, Xal'atath was unmasked as our Harbinger. It is also when we discovered that Locust Walker knew who Xal'atath was. This, obviously, was a warning for the future, and a huge win for Xal'atath, because now, through a wild goose chase full of taunts aimed at her weak points, Alleria was now unbalanced. And right when she needed them to be, all eyes were on Alleria. Sensing threat, Azeroth's World Soul began singing. It reached out to many, including Magni Bronzebeard, who had been the Speaker of Azeroth at this point for quite a few years. He was told to go to Khaz Algar. He filled us in, and suddenly the champions of Azeroth loaded up Dalaran for yet another expedition. But this time, it was set up for failure. It was set up to be the opposite of Dalaran's role in the Legion expansion, the very expansion where Xal'atath was introduced to the story. Xal'atath rid herself of the Drendon disguise and unleashed her Nerubian armies. She blew Dalaran out of the sky, we crash-landed on Khaz Algar, and suddenly were thrust into her trap. Over and under the island, we fought our way through the Scaradin, the Void-crazed Arathi, and a legion of Nerubians, all the way to Azj-Kahet. We poured our hate and anger for Xal'atath into that campaign. We were getting back at the Nerubians who blew Dalaran out of the sky. Then Alleria realized something. Below our feet was the blood of the old gods, and just like on Pandaria, it had been feeding upon our hatred. This is exactly what Xal'atath wanted. It is what she was counting on. We were fueling this blood. Her plan was going perfectly. Until, that is, Alleria got smart. She finally cornered Xal'atath in the Priory of the Sacred Flame, just as Xal'atath was drawing the power of a darkened Bellular, along with all the old god blood, into the Darkheart, adding, of course, to the essence of Galakrond and all of the magic absorbed from Dalaran. Alleria knew she would not be able to win that fight, so instead, she shot the Darkheart. Everything hinged on the Darkheart, as you will soon see, and now it was broken. While it is true that the Dragon Soul was designed by an Altharian, it was actually built by his goblin slaves. Remember, the Darkheart was a prototype for the Dragon Soul. As such, Xal'atath needed to find people who could fix it. And luckily, she was already infiltrating goblin society through a new cartel called the Darkfuse. They were the new muscle for Jastor Gallywix. He'd recently been thrown out of the Horde for siding with Sylvanas and was rebuilding his wealth in Undermine. And along with his wealth, his control, an iron grip. Xal'atath was, of course, then on hand to offer him everything that he wanted. As long as he could go and fix the Darkheart, she would ensure his goons had all the power that they needed. So, Gallywix got his domination of Goblin Society back, and Xal'atath got for herself a fixed Darkheart. Or at least that would have been the plan. That's not what happened. You see, Gallywix is the type of guy who understands leverage. He now had a fixed Darkheart. He knew he had leverage, so he held out. He tried to squeeze a bit more from their arrangement. But what he didn't count on was how hot we were on his trail. Gallywix was soon cornered by us, and he was even about to give up the Darkheart when a Shadowguard Ethereal appeared behind him and snatched it. He, of course, assumed the Ethereals were working for Xal'atath. So did we. We had quite literally seen that during our initial hunt for the Darkheart. But we and he could not have been more wrong. You see, Xal'atath was furious, and it quickly would become obvious that the Ethereals actually had their own goals in mind. They took the Darkheart, and they brought it to the husk of their fallen homeworld, Koresh, and there they would use it to bring back Dimensius. You see, while he had been shattered, they had spent hundreds of thousands of years collecting the pieces, including one that we would encounter in the Burning Crusade. With the pieces together, and now a vessel full of power, they had all they needed to bring Dimensius back. Of course, that succeeded. Dimensius would be back, and he was pissed. But more than that, he was more powerful than her. She knew it. She was in existential danger, but as ever, she knew how to turn this to her advantage. Dimensius was a clear and present threat, so we blasted it off to Koresh to face off against him. And in this fight, Locust Walker was our top asset. He was a Void expert, but while he was our top asset, His top asset in this fight was actually Xal'atath. This was a shock reveal, but it did actually make sense that we, once again, were fighting alongside Xal'atath. There was no pretense, there was no illusion that we were actually allies and had the same overarching goals, but we needed each other. And through our quest together, we discovered that she is the one who helped Locust Walker destroy Koresh to shatter Dimensius. And across the ruined world, we would find the place littered with cults that once worshipped Xal'atath. And beholding the destruction, it was clear she did a number on this world and its people. But there wasn't time to examine history. A Void Lord was present and it needed to be taken down. Alongside Locust Walker, she broke us into Mana Forge Omega. There, we weakened Dimensius to the point that he could be trapped within the Darkheart. And after fighting the literal manifestation of a black hole, we dropped back into reality. And looking back upon the vessel we had just been in, it was clear the Darkheart was tweaking with power. Dimensius wasn't defeated, he was trapped. But so was Xal'atath. Perhaps a fitting end? Obviously not. Locust Walker reached for the Darkheart, and that is when Alleria heard Xal'atath laughing from the shadows. This was another trap. Locust Walker took the Darkheart and was immediately incinerated, and from the fire that consumed his body, Xal'atath appears. The games were over. Then the next time they meet, she would take everything Alleria loved. And that is what brings us to midnight. Xal'atath now has the power of a Void Lord trapped within the Darkheart. She has all of that power with next to nothing standing in her way. And that means it's time for her to make the final move in her survival of the fittest philosophy. It's time for her to climb once more up the ladder and consume the most powerful thing in the cosmos, Azeroth herself. And the next step in that plan is taking the Sunwell. That's the event that kicks off the Midnight expansion.